And I hand it back to Brian.
You know what, President Nelson? You want to know why this topic was included in this week's, as one day for just this topic? Really, I've based this whole week's conversation on the contributors to my son's end-of-life decision. A second. I based this whole week's conversation on my son's end-of-life decision. Abuse was the heaviest contributor. That was the first day. He was called faggot every day. That was the second day. The worthiness interviews, I have no doubt, harmed his mental health. And now an issue of conscience. You know, while I was reading through his chat logs, he had a person, and it was a child's website too. This person, this is not the church doing this, but it did create a shelf problem. It was he was on a children's website, and there was a person that was supposed to be monitoring the room. They're not supposed to talk about religion or anything of that nature, but he was a hardened atheist, the very person supposed to be monitoring the children's room. And he was trying to talk a bunch of children out of their belief in God. And as I read through those chat logs, this went on for months, and not just my son, but this went on for months with every child in the group. Truthfully, if I was going to sue somebody, I probably could have sued them too, because that was clear negligence. That children's website. But before my son's abuse started, he always defended God and religion to this atheist, and this was an activist atheist. This atheist bragged that he had convinced 24 children ages 8 to 18 out of their belief in God. This is his own words. I had to read that chat log, and he was telling that to my son as well. Before that, my son always defended the church, always defended religion. But I have the day his abuse started to the very minute, the very day. Because I know the day my son went to the church and got abused. And I can read those chat logs. And he continued to defend God and religion against this militant atheist. And then he was talking to children. And I could see that his faith in God was deteriorating because of the abuse. And it came to a point where he said to this atheist, he said, maybe you're right. Because he said he prayed and asked for help against the abuse that he was experiencing at the church. And that help never came. It never came for him. So he said, maybe you're right. And then he lost his faith in God. At least he was on the path to losing his faith in God. And so on top of being abused, severely abused at church, on top of self-loathing himself over worthiness interviews and the things they ask, he also was going to lose his faith in God because of some guy on a children's website doing what he shouldn't have done. Kind of like what you're doing. You're doing what you should not be doing. This man was also doing. I did confront him too, actually. Got on Roblox. Just told you the name of the children's website. And confronted him, and I probably should have sued them. When a person loses their faith in God, often, especially when there's a child, terribly harmful. Terribly harmful. And me, being the lazy learner that I am, I didn't give my son enough room to have that faith crisis. I know it was a smaller contributor. I didn't give him enough room for a conversation. Just like you're not doing, President Nelson. You're not giving enough room for a conversation either. A genuine, heartfelt conversation. Because you put boundaries down on those conversations. And in that, I didn't listen carefully enough. Kind of like what you're doing, President Nelson. You're not listening carefully enough either. And you know, when you lose a child to suicide, the amount of things that go through your mind and you have to work through, that was just one more item. I forced him to go do worthiness interviews. I forced him to the church. He wanted to quit going to a place where he was being abused. Didn't listen. He was having a faith crisis. I didn't give him any room. I helped put him in that pressure cooker because I followed you, President Nelson, and those who preceded you. And it resulted in his suicide. That was the third contributor. And, you know, we know that suicide is terribly complicated. And I had to figure all this out, but that was the third heaviest contributor, is the issues of conscience for him. And those were brought on the other two, actually. It sparked the third issue of conscience. We can do better. You don't want to be like me, a lazy learner and someone who doesn't listen carefully enough. Because there's great harm coming when people don't listen. They don't work it out. When they're a lazy learner, kind of like I am. You know? Something else, President Nelson. These issues are all being magnified by the internet. All of them. You know, a child can go and they can get abused on the internet. That's how I know my son was abused. That's how I know he was called faggot 80 times the night before he killed himself. It's the internet. You know, in your day, when you were a youth, you got picked on at school and you went home and you were safe. And there was no place of harm. Once you got home, you were safe in your own home. But with the internet, that abuse continues. Continues on the child at home. And predators are there too. You know that they can also go on the internet and find all kinds of horrible things, pornography. So the temptation is way, way, way off the charts compared to anything you would have experienced, President Nelson. Today's youth are living in a completely different world than you. And that's bringing more harm. So now you're to live the chase, and I know most of the children want to be chased, but they're having a much greater temptation than you or I ever experienced. We've got to have a more delicate hand and more love as we approach the children, the youth. And the third thing, President Nelson, is people can go and they can research anything now. And this is adults too. It's not like the old days where you had to go dig and find some book. It's not the world you grew up, President Nelson. Now you can go on the internet and you can find almost anything you want. And when you find information that raises doubts, that puts items on your shelf, it gets heavy pretty quick. Because the access to so much information is so much quicker now that the shelf gets heavier so much quicker. We're not in the same world anymore with the internet. I hope you'll recognize that, President Nelson. I'm pleading with you. You're the key. The only reason I keep saying your name is because I know there's nobody else.